One of the fascinating things about these locomotives is that they were actually a collaborative effort between all three of the major locomotive builders in the early 1940s. Baldwin, Alco, and Lima were all required by the federal government under the Marshall Plan to participate in the construction of these locomotives. It's interesting that each one of them, and as they progressed through the orders, they all had slightly different features depending on which of the builders was building any particular aspect of the locomotive. For example, a number of the boilers were built by Baldwin, whereas the running gear, the tenders, and the tender frames were built by Lima, and then other aspects of the locomotive were procured by Lima. And then the same rotation would change, whereas Lima would build certain parts, then Alco would procure certain parts, and then Baldwin would assemble a locomotive. So there were things that were being done at each of the three plants. The other interesting thing about the history of this is that during the years that the locomotives were built for the Marshall Plan, of which there were a number of different types of locomotives built, the 141R is definitely one of the types, the S160 is another type that was built for through the Marshall Plan, was that it really put a damper on the number of locomotives that the American roads were allowed to buy during the war years. We hear about and talk about the material supply demands, and not only were those material supply demands hard on the builders because of this Marshall Plan, it was also hard for the builders to build the locomotives with the materials that they had and still try to meet the demands of the American builders. This is part of what launched General Electric and EMD into their diesel locomotive design. Very interesting history. One of the things that sets a good fireman apart from a bad one, or one that's a little bit better than another, I guess I could say, is that sometimes you'll see a fireman want to touch everything and work with everything, and you're flying down the railroad and he's moving things around and touching everything. A couple of colleagues and I have had some running bets before as to how far we could actually run the locomotive without touching anything. The neat thing about a stoker-fired locomotive, and this locomotive in particular, is that once you've got it set up and you've got everything working just the way you want it, you should be able to set it and just leave it and run for 15, 20, maybe even more miles before you really have to make an adjustment or change anything or do anything to the locomotive. One of the things that we're trying to teach here is the idea that once you've got everything set, you just set it and leave it. And the locomotive, like a person in a way, will almost start to take care of itself if you set it right. If you haven't set it right, it'll go bad really quick, but otherwise, if you've got it set up right, it'll run for a long period of time without having to do anything. So as you watch the cab footage today of us operating the locomotive, notice how we're really working on not making a lot of adjustments, getting the locomotive set, leaving it the best we can for the longest period of time. It does two things. It's better for your fuel and your water, it's better on the locomotive, and it's better on you as a fireman. You're making so many adjustments and you just can't get a feel for what the locomotive is doing. It's best to get it set up, let it do what it wants to do, let it work a little bit on its own, and then just make minor adjustments as you need to. So again, watch as we go through the cab footage today, and as you watch our ride in the cab, and notice how infrequently we're trying to make adjustments and just let the locomotive stabilize itself and run. things that I like about this locomotive is that it's a very modern locomotive. In other words, it was built right at the end of the steam era, and even when it was built, it had some of the best efficiency devices put on it when it was built. For example, all of the running gear is 4-speed oil lubrication. Another really neat thing about this locomotive is that all of the bearings, including the side rods, are Babbitt bearings. So they're not roller bearings, they're not just plain brass on crank pins. They actually have a thin layer of Babbitt inside of the brass, and that helps lubricate it. I thought I'd take a minute and bring everybody underneath the locomotive and show you what I was talking about earlier about one of the things that I like about this locomotive, which is that it has a full 4-speed lubrication system. Additionally, it has Babbitt bearings on all of the drive axles. Babbitt bearings are as good, at least in my opinion, as good or better than roller bearings in a lot of cases. They run very cool. They lubricate very well. They'll last a long time. And they operate very well. They'll take the weight. They'll withstand the pressures that are put on it. I've read articles in the past that have alluded to the fact that a Babbitt bearing is as good or better than a roller bearing. And I believe that in a steam locomotive that's probably very true. We do have a number of locomotives in the States that do have Babbitt bearings. The Daylight is probably the most notable, the 4449. And then with the locomotives that we've worked on, this would be the most notable Babbitt bearing locomotive that we've ever worked on. Here's another view of the lubrication system. The lubrication system runs into splitters that actually take the oil in and then rotate around to 4 or 5 or even 6 different lubrication points on a locomotive. So only 1 in 6 shots of oil actually makes it to any one given point, but over a period of time every individual piece is getting plenty or enough oil to meet the demand and meet the needs. You can actually see here the Babbitt in the bearing. And then you can see the oil cellar box here. Again, it's not very often that we get to take you on a tour underneath the locomotive with such great light conditions to be able to see so many different aspects of the bottom side of the locomotive. Whether or not you really like them or not, this locomotive is also fitted with Franklin automatic wedge adjusters. They definitely have their pros and cons, but at the time the locomotive was built, it was definitely noted as an advancement in the technology and construction of steam locomotives. And obviously the French viewed them as being an adequate advancement, as they were left on the locomotives and never removed from the locomotives. Aside from the running gear and the mechanical features this locomotive has, it's also got a stoker on it. And this stoker is exactly like the stoker we see in the States. Some of our superpower in the States has a couple more jets on it, but otherwise it's the same configuration, same setup. We've got the jet control here, and then we've got the stoker motor, stoker booster control here, blower up here, and then it's also got a water pump, feed water heater and water pump, Worthington type pump. So it's really got all of the things that big steam and big superpower had back in the day, just before we saw steam go away. The neat part about this locomotive is that all of these systems work perfectly on this locomotive. The size of firebox it has, the size of cylinders, the speed that the locomotive operates, the amount of tonnage it's able to haul. This locomotive actually has more equipment on it than it really needs, and therefore the equipment doesn't have to run all that hard or overwork itself to be able to do the job that it needs to. The other neat thing about it is, if you get just a little bit behind, you can work with this locomotive and it'll build back very quickly. The boiler work that we've just done is so tight, and we've got the boiler so tight now, other than a couple leaking valves and some tacking and things that normally go wrong, but the boiler itself is so tight now that it steams very well. Water's flowing very well in it. It does have thermic siphons, which was another advancement of the late steam days. So all of these things, the siphons, the type boiler, all of these modern appliances on it, really make this a very fine locomotive and a very balanced locomotive. So it's really neat to operate this. The only thing that's odd about it is that the fireman's sitting on the right-hand side, whereas normally in the States the engineer sits on the right-hand side, the fireman on the left. But one of the neat features about it is that the throttle box and some of the parts can be changed, so you can sit on either side of the locomotive. But the French wanted it this particular way, and so it's always stayed this way. Interesting note is that the Swiss actually drive on the right side and have the fireman on the left side. So the way the locomotive is set up now reflects the way that the French had it set up just after the war when the locomotive was delivered to the French. So other than the fact that it's fairly original and it operates in Switzerland, not much has changed on it since the days that it was in France and the days that it operated. Another interesting thing about this locomotive is that it operated in France clear up into the 60s. Clearly we had seen the end of steam in America, but these locomotives, the 141Rs, operated very late into France. In fact, we have some records of them operating even into the 70s on regular passenger trains and some late freight trains. It was a very reliable locomotive. They got a lot of good miles out of them. They ran really well. The appliances stood up very well. Just for the French, it was a very good locomotive, and even today in Switzerland, it's a very big locomotive, and it performs very well.